We're joined by S. Mitra Kalita of Epicenter NYC, which connects New Yorkers across various neighborhoods and communities. She's lived in Queens for a long time and is very engaged with the community, both locally as well as on national issues. And we are going to be talking to her about immigration specifically, locally and nationally, as well as what she's looking at in the run-up to the U.S. presidential elections. Thanks for joining us, Mitra.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to ask you, in your work with Epicenter NYC, which started about in 2020, when you talk to immigrants, and you talk to a whole range of them, not just South Asians, but also Latinos and other communities, what are you hearing from them, especially in the last 6 months, as the rhetoric has really amped up in this contest between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, even though Kamala Harris only joined it about less than 100 days ago?
Sure. Well, I think very much Queens is defined by a history of immigration. And so it's hard to separate the waves of migration from this current moment, because so much of the rhetoric, as you point out, is rooted in this idea that there's the right way to enter the United States and there's the wrong way to enter the United States. And the reality of a place like Queens is, of course, the story is much more complicated. If you think about America's history and Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty and this iconic, image we have, back in those days, there was no paperwork, there were no H-1B visas, there was no green card lottery, there was no legal path to migration in the way that I think a lot of the rhetoric right now is really focused upon. If we want to drill it down to how people are feeling, I think it really depends on the migrant themselves. And what do I mean by that? For some immigrants, immigration and a legal path to, let's say, citizenship or even a green card might be the single most important thing in their life, right? For other immigrants in Queens, it's going to be their children's schools. It might be running a small business and feeling like after COVID, things are not what they used to be, right? Our customer base is now back, or New York City is now back to what was. And so I think this focus on migration is really interesting because it's very polarizing, as you've seen, right? There's rallies that definitely other the immigrant. That when I say other the immigrant, they're treated as outsiders. They're not welcome. The Trump rallies come to mind as far as that rhetoric. But I think for immigrants themselves, it's much more complicated, where the picture of the issues they care about most as a voter actually mirror the issues that the average American voter cares about, such as schools, safety, and so on.
And that's something we don't hear as often. You're talking more about the commonalities and the common ground, why people have come to America over years. Starting from 1700s, right? It goes back far back. But if I bring it back again to the present, when it comes now specifically also to Indians and South Asians, we have talked a lot about H-1B issues as well as green card issues, the backlog. But at the same time, in the last 2 years specifically, we've also seen a spike in undocumented Indian immigrants coming in a lot from the Canadian border as well. So what are your thoughts on that? Are you seeing it play out here in the communities here in New York?
Yeah. So right now we're in Jackson Heights, Queens. It is impossible to look at this community and not think about the prevalence of undocumented immigrants. It is an overlap. So meaning you might have families where some people are documented, some people are undocumented, some people are citizens and will be voting. But that overlap is very much a part of the fabric of this neighborhood. Indian immigrants are no different. And so what we've seen in Jackson Heights as a thoroughfare, my father himself came here in 1971, lived for a short stint just about 12 blocks from where we are right now, with a roommate from Assam, and that is their story, right? The H-1B visa and the undocumented migrant issue that you mentioned from India, I think, is often kind of masked. I don't think people realize that as many undocumented Indian immigrants are here as they are. I believe According to some studies, it might be the second fastest growing group of undocumented migrants, coming both, as you mentioned, the Canadian border and through Mexico. Why is this happening? You know, I think one thing to consider in the H-1B visa issue historically gives us a reason for this. There are very few ways to enter the United States legally, right? The H-1B visa is actually a temporary visa. You're saying, I'm going to go back home, right? The student visa is a temporary visa. You're saying, I'm going to study here and go back home. Green cards, as you know, for Indians is like years and years of a wait. So the path to come in the so-called right way, as a lot of the right-wing rhetoric has leaned into, there actually are not that many paths. So you are seeing, I think, a desperation that is leading to the undocumented immigration. I think you're also seeing a surge in asylum seekers, which of course now President Biden has put a stop to the ability to seek asylum. But, you know, over the last few months, as you pointed out, the rhetoric around asylum seekers and, you know, these images we have of hundreds of migrants entering New York City in an immigrant neighborhood like this, on the one hand, this is a neighborhood defined by migration. People come and go, right? And so can we absorb it? Of course we can absorb it. We've been absorbing this for decades. On the other hand, do you see a strain on services, hospitals, schools? Absolutely, right? So you will point to schools that might say, you know, it's not that we can't fit the new students, but we might not have the right services. And so one anecdote that comes to mind, I was in a classroom and I saw a table full of migrant children, mostly Latino, one West African, and one Chinese child. And so what you also have is like a lumping together of these migrants because they don't speak English. They're in a classroom where the teacher doesn't have the ability to educate them in other ways. And so that's the type of strain that you're seeing on services in New York City. Did that answer your question? Or
Yes, no, you did answer the question. And now I want to pull out a little bit and also talk about some of Donald Trump's. There was this rally at Madison Square Garden over the weekend, and there was a comedian called Puerto Rico an island of garbage. In the past, former President Trump has called America a dumping ground. So this debate over immigration is not new to this election, but these kind of words, garbage and dumping ground, they seem to be particularly vitriolic. And I'm curious as to what you see the impact of that would be on this race or is having on this race, obviously at the national level, but also if you're seeing any impact at the local level. So if you could answer this both for national and local.
It's a really important point. So the rally that was held, there were elements of it that felt intentionally to rile up the crowd against immigrants, which feels very dangerous in a city like New York that has been built on immigration. The reaction that we're seeing from our Latino neighbors has been one, for the most part, I'm hearing a lot of hurt. I'm also hearing a lot of, are we surprised? Because this is somebody who has repeatedly scapegoated Latino immigrants. And then there's another reaction, which is thanks to social media and celebrity culture, which is one of great pride, right? So Bad Bunny, for example, the a very accomplished musician, has come out and endorsed Kamala Harris. There's a video going viral of his assertion of Puerto Rican identity and what it means for him. This happens to be an issue I know a little bit about. I'm an Indian who was raised in Puerto Rico. Yeah. And so I feel very I feel very close to Puerto Ricans. I loved my time there. But I also think there's such similarities to the culture of India, right? Warmth, very neighborly, rooted in big families and food and music and culture. And so I think one thing you're seeing with immigrants who are scapegoated is this repeated, almost lumping together of us, right? And there is a danger in that because it can feel like, if your children are walking down the street, will they be subject to a hate crime? Like, are we making it okay to keep scapegoating immigrants? On the other hand, I think it is creating some solidarity, right? And so if you look at, for example, the South Asians for Harris, right? There's the South Asian women for Harris, the South Asian men for Harris, South Asian comedians for Harris, South Asian writers for Harris. I mean, the number of sub-identities that are formed out of an immigrant group that is identifying with her is actually quite plentiful. And so people leaning into their niche and the power of the collective, I think, is one takeaway from how the response to this election might be a little bit different than elections past. Just one other point on that rally. I think one other thing that surprises people locally is that New York, despite being a city built on immigration and we're situated in a very blue state, a very blue city, that New York will overwhelmingly go for Kamala Harris is not breaking news to anybody, right? That being said, we have pockets here that are definitely pro-Trump, and even in neighborhoods like this one, where there are divides created among immigrant groups, I do think that the Trump camp has leaned into this tactic of division as a way of winning over some Latino voters. And that's something also that feels uniquely related to the migrant situation that we were talking about.
Yeah, that's true. Like whenever we talk about immigrant communities, there's a tendency to think that they are a monolith, and they're not. Even within the South Asian communities, which tends to, at least according to research, tend to lean a little bit more toward the Democratic side. There are plenty of Indians in business and otherwise who are going to be voting for Donald Trump. So it is really a mix. And I'm curious on that point to get your reaction to the division that's clearly made between legal and illegal immigration, and how do you think that impacts this debate? Because there are plenty of legal immigrants who will argue that they are upset with so-called illegal immigration or even asylum seekers because they feel that's an easy way out, whereas they have really worked their way up through legal immigration. So that dichotomy, what's your take on it?
Yeah. So I think the dichotomy between legal and illegal often boils down to a class distinction, but we're using the framework of legal and illegal. And so it tends to be higher educated, professional immigrants. One shorthand for this has been the best and brightest, right? So the post-1965 immigrants that came to the United States, my father was among them, really taking graduates of, for example, like an IIT and saying, this is going to be the type of immigrant that the U.S. favors. Economic reality is actually a lot more complex. We need a diversity of professions, of source countries, and educational backgrounds for an economy that's built on immigration, that's the United States, to work. And so one example I'd give you is actually from a battleground state. So there's about, I believe, an estimated 400,000 South Asian voters across the battleground states, meaning this is a population that can actually make a big difference. Because when you go district by district, in many cases, it comes down to a matter of a few votes, right? So I think it's a very, very important voting bloc. In places like Western Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania, of course, is one of the swing states, right? Kamala Harris is there pretty much every other day, right? Yeah. Donald Trump has been there quite frequently. Pennsylvania, in the western part of the state, without immigration, there's a question mark over whether this economy would still continue to grow. Right? And so when we look at U.S. population trends, the demographic destiny, as people say, there's a dependence on immigration economically that I think a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric can be very short-sighted because the United States survival, especially in some of these states where there's population loss. Not a lot of industries like manufacturing that, are what used to keep these places going. You've shifted to a more services economy, healthcare economies. You walk into any hospital in the United States, from your doctors, meaning your high end of the profession, down to your health aides, right? Who are the people doing those jobs, right? And so you asked about some of the rhetoric against Latinos. In one of the vice presidential debates, there was rhetoric against Haitian immigrants. Health aides, for the most part, in this caregiving economy, a huge number are Latino and Haitian immigrants. And so I think that economic dependence is something that hopefully the Democrats would celebrate. Of course, that's not necessary. I think that they've succumbed a little bit to the border security rhetoric that Trump has forced into the conversation.
Talking about border security, former President Donald Trump has clearly said that as soon as he gets into office, if he's elected, he's going to start deporting by the millions. Now, how feasible is that? He hasn't talked about how he's going to do it. But how much do you think that's rhetoric? How much do you think he's actually going to influence? And I know you don't have a crystal ball, but what is your overall take on if he is elected? Is he likely to actually do this? And also, on the other hand, with Vice President Kamala Harris, she is also talking about strengthening the border and using very prosecutorial language around it, though she obviously does not talk about deporting by the millions. So are there any commonalities between the two candidates, and do you think it's likely that he will do something that he's saying he will?
Yeah, I was at the Democratic National Convention, and what struck me about Kamala Harris's speech is that it begins as a celebration of immigration, right? Her mother immigrated from India, her father from Jamaica. She says, "I stand before you, the product of this union." And then what happens? She shifts to border security, right? To closing the borders. And to me, it felt like that was a closing of possibility for the future Kamala Harrises of the world, right? And so there is this irony of her candidacy. Now, I think Donald Trump has forced her hand on some of the border security issues and the migration issues in a pretty fundamental way, as we saw in her speech. I will say, in this neighborhood, during the first Trump administration, there would be rumors constantly of deportation roundups, of ICE coming and raiding people's apartments. And so there are a few nights I can think of. So just one block over, we have a strip on Northern Boulevard in Jackson Heights, which goes into Corona. It goes from a kind of Indian, Bangladeshi area into more of a Latino area. It's an active nightclub scene. And on some of those nights, because of these rumors, it would be absolutely empty, right? Which tells you two things. One, that fear that you're describing is very real, whether it's rooted or not, right? Meaning these were just rumors that there's going to be deportation. Actually, I don't really think it happened on those specific nights, but the fear was enough to keep people off the streets. The second is what is a reality of overlapping undocumented migrants being a part of New York City life in every facet. So who suffers from that? It's not just the undocumented immigrant, it's every business owner on that street. It's a way of life that is so dependent on undocumented labor, but also undocumented people as consumers and taxpayers. And so I think while both candidates are talking about doing things the right way and closing down border security, we're not dealing with the issue in front of us, which is how do we legalize this portion of the economy that we are entirely dependent upon, right? That to me feels like nobody's talking about that, and that's actually the issue that would be very helpful for future voters, in the United States.
And lastly, Mitra, last question. Now we have 6 days left to go. So, what are you watching for? And you don't have to tell us who you're going to vote for necessarily, but if you don't want to. But what are you watching for? What are you hoping happens? For this huge sort of drama of democracy.
Such a huge question. So I voted 2 days ago. Another trend we've been seeing in New York City, but across the country, is early voting. And there are record numbers of people who are, it's not election day anymore. It's election days, even election weeks, really, because people are voting so early. So I voted 2 days ago. My hope, I'm a registered independent, and so I won't tell you who I vote for. It's my kind of journalistic, it's like this identity that I still cling to. I'm sure people can guess. That being said, I cling to democracy. A lot of people have said every 4 years, this is painted as the most important election of our lifetimes. And at some stage, that hyperbole feels irresponsible, right? But looking at the first Trump administration and some of the fears that occurred in this neighborhood, some of the concerns I have as a mother and as a woman, I think that a lot of early voting is indicative of people seeing this as a real do or die election for democracy. I really do believe that. And so my hope is that democracy prevails. We are preparing for safety and security issues. It feels like the only responsible way to practice journalism in the United States right now, or actually around the world. I'm sure this feels familiar, but just making sure that we are equipped in case you see violence like what we saw on January 6th in the interim between Election Day and inauguration. That's something that we're talking to our journalists about. Epicenter is a part of the URL Media Network. It's a network of community media organizations around the country. We have many Indian news outlets among us. And so I feel like there is a hope for democracy, but I would be lying if I said that that wasn't tempered by a fear of not just another January 6th, but potentially many January 6th, because no matter what happens with the outcome of this election, I think it's safe to say that about 50% of the country will not be happy with that result.
Yeah.
And so where does that leave us? As democracy has been practiced in the U.S., it leaves us with dialogue, discussion, sort of a we'll agree to disagree. But as we've also seen, it can leave us with, very violent, real situations that call that very democracy into question.
Thank you so much. That was S. Mitra Kalita talking to us about various facets of immigration and also her hopes for democracy as well as some of the fears. And in Queens, New York, this is Natasha Srani for NDTV World.